No door in the valley opened for her. The farmer who did had no idea she was the matriarch's daughter. The notice was folded in Edric's shirt pocket when he found her, and it had been there since morning, pressed flat against his ribs like a stone he couldn't put down. 37 gold marks. That was what the valley's land creditor wanted by the first day of the next month, or the north field. The one his father had broken with a hand plow 50 years ago would be signed over before winter. Edric had walked the fence line that evening to look at it one last time, because a man does that when something is slipping away from him. He looks. He doesn't cry. He just looks. He was coming back along the low ditch at the field's eastern edge, lantern in hand, when the lantern light caught something that had no business being there. She was lying against the fence post with her knees drawn up, her head dropped forward into the crook of her elbow, and her traveling leathers so muddy and road-worn that at first he thought she was a fallen log. Then he saw the slow rise and fall of her back, and the green of her skin in the lantern glow, and the long tusks that curved up from her jaw, and he stopped walking. She was an orc woman. She was large, taller than Edric by half a head, even folded down like that, and her black hair had come loose from its road braid and fallen across her face. Her hands, resting loose on the grass, were calloused and scarred in the way of someone who had worked hard for a long time. She was breathing, but the breathing was shallow and fast, and when Edric crouched down and held the lantern closer, he could see the gray-pale flush of fever on her cheeks beneath the green. He reached out and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She was burning. He straightened up and looked down the dark lane toward the village. The inn was a quarter-mile east. Old Brannock kept the only decent fire going this late in the season, and there was a physician, old Tomas Fenn, who charged what the market would bear and slept above his own shop. Edric looked at her, and then at the lane, and then at her again. He picked her up. She was heavy. She stirred when he lifted her, made a sound low in her throat, and her eyes opened partway, dark eyes, unfocused with fever, and then closed again. Edric adjusted his grip under her shoulders and her knees and started walking. Brannock opened his indoor 6 inches and held it there. He was a broad, ruddy man, the kind who had run a comfortable establishment for 20 years and liked it that way. He looked at the orc woman draped in Edric's arms and then at Edric, and his face did what Edric had expected it to do. "No," Brannock said. "She's feverish. She needs a bed and a fire." "Not mine, she doesn't." "Brannock, she'll die of cold before morning if she sleeps on the ground." Then she should have thought about that before she came here. He said it without particular cruelty, which Edric found almost worse than if he'd said it with some. It was just a statement of policy, easy as breathing. "You're a decent man, Edric. You know what happens when you let one of them through a door. The whole clan follows. I've got a wife and 2 daughters upstairs. She's sick, she's not an army. They all start as one." The door closed. Edric stood in the lane a moment. The fever woman in his arms stirred again, muttered something in a language he didn't know. He felt the heat radiating off her even through his coat. He crossed the lane to the physician's house. Tomas Fenn's light was on in the upper window. The man kept late hours over his books. Edric knocked with his boot since his hands were full. He knocked 3 times before the shutter above opened, and Fenn leaned out, squinting down. "It's Edric Voss. I've got a sick woman, fever, probably since yesterday from the look of her." Fenn looked at the orc woman in his arms for a long moment. He was an educated man, a reading man, but his face did its own arithmetic in the lantern light. "I don't treat orcs," he said. "I'm sorry, Edric, that's a hard line. You'd best take her to the commons and let her wake up on her own." "The commons is open ground. It's 38 degrees out. I know what the temperature is." "Then you know she'll be in serious trouble by dawn." "There are limits to what I can do," Fenn said, and there was something uncomfortable in his voice, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it, something he was working to keep closed. "I have other patients to think of. I can't have her kind in my practice." The shutter closed. Edric stood in the empty lane. The village was dark and quiet. Somewhere a dog barked once and went still. The woman in his arms made a small sound, like a question, and her head tilted against his shoulder without waking. He turned and walked home. His farmhouse was small, one main room with a kitchen hearth, a narrow bedroom off the back, and a loft he'd never found a use for since his wife passed. He laid the orc woman on the settle beside the hearth, which was wide and long enough to hold her if she curled slightly. He built up the fire and went to the kitchen and put water on. She didn't wake while he worked, but the fever was plain enough. Her breathing had the rough, hitching quality of a body fighting something in its chest. He found his spare wool blanket, the good one, the heavy one, and spread it over her. He didn't own a physician's kit, but he'd tended sick animals and a sick wife long enough to know the basics: warmth, water, broth. He had a heel of last week's bread and some dried root vegetables and a bit of smoked pork in the larder. He cut it all into the pot with the water and set it to simmer, then came back and sat in the chair across from her and watched her breathe. She was not what he'd imagined when he'd thought of orc women, the handful of times he'd thought of them at all. He'd seen orcs at the twice-yearly market in the big valley town, usually at the edge of things, trading pelts or ironwork, watched by everyone and engaged by almost no one. They'd always seemed contained, self-possessed, carrying their size and their difference the way a person carries something heavy they've learned to carry. This one, sick and unconscious, looked neither fearsome nor foreign. She looked like someone who had been walking for a very long time and had simply run out of road. Her leathers were travel-worn but well-made. Good stitching, not cheap frontier work. The pack she'd had on her back, he'd set it by the door, was solid oiled leather, the kind a serious traveler carried. And her hands, resting on the blanket edge, were not the hands of someone who'd been wandering ragged. They were a working person's hands, hardened by honest use, but the nails were clean, and the wrists above them bore a faint mark, barely visible, the ghost of a braid or bracelet that had been removed before she set out. Edric didn't think too hard about any of it. He went and checked his broth. When it was ready, he brought a bowl and crouched beside the settle and tried to coax some of it into her. She woke enough for that, eyes still mostly closed, but she drank. 3 good swallows, and then she turned her head away. He took it as a good sign and set the bowl on the hearthstone to stay warm. He meant to stay in the chair just a little while. He woke at first light with a crick in his neck, and the fire burned down to coals and the orc woman sitting up on the settle, watching him. Her eyes were dark gray, not black as he'd thought. She was looking at him with a kind of careful steadiness, measuring, the way a person looks at something new when they haven't yet decided what it is. "Morning," Edric said. "Morning," she said. Her voice was low, a little rough with the remnants of the fever. He got up and put more wood on the fire without making any particular ceremony of it, and went to heat the broth back up. "How do you feel?" "Better than last night, a beat. You found me at the field." "You were against the fence post. I thought you were a log at first." Something crossed her face, not offense, more like a tired acknowledgement. "I was trying to make it to the next village." "That's 5 miles. You wouldn't have made it." "No," she said, "I know." He brought her the broth and she took it in both hands and drank it properly this time, steadily, without rushing. He watched her from the kitchen doorway. The color was better in her face, the gray pale gone, the green-brown restored. She'd pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and sat with her back straight even so, with a dignity that hadn't faded with the fever. "I tried the inn and the physician," he said, "for what it's worth." She looked at him over the rim of the bowl. "I know what the answer was." "I'm sorry about that." "Don't apologize for other men's choices." She said it gently, not bitterly, like someone who had filed that particular fact long ago and moved on. He made himself a bowl of broth as well and sat back in his chair. "Are you passing through or heading somewhere?" "Passing through," she said. "I have a road to finish." He nodded and didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. They sat in the early morning firelight and ate their broth, and outside the window the valley was silver with frost, and the sun was just beginning to pink the eastern ridge. "My name is Myra," she said when the bowl was empty. She said it simply, without anything attached. "Edric Voss," he said, "this is my farm." She looked around the room, the low beams, the worn kitchen shelves, the single window with its good thick glass, the scrubbed plank floor that had needed scrubbing for longer than he'd gotten around to it. "It's a good house," she said. He thought of the notice in his pocket. "It's been a good house," he said. She caught the tense, but she didn't ask. She stayed 2 days more than either of them expected. The fever was slower leaving than it had arrived. The second morning she was on her feet and moving around the kitchen, clearly intending to leave, and she made it as far as the yard before she had to sit down on the chopping block with her head in her hands. He brought her back inside without making a fuss about it, and she let him, which told him more about how bad she felt than anything she would have said. On the third day she was genuinely better. He knew because she stood in the kitchen doorway at sunrise with her arms crossed and said, "What needs doing?" Edric looked at her. The harvest was 3 weeks behind where it should be. He'd been trying to do it alone, and a man alone in a 40-acre field at the start of winter loses. "I'm not going to put a sick guest to work." "I'm not sick anymore." She tilted her head toward the field. "And I know what harvest work looks like, what needs doing." He picked up the scythe he'd been about to carry out and handed it to her. She worked like 2 men. That was the plain truth of it. She had reach and strength that no human farmhand could match, and she moved through the grain stand without hurrying, in a steady rhythmic sweep that Edric watched once from across the field and then stopped watching because it made him feel slow by comparison. By midday they'd taken down more than he'd managed in the previous 3 days alone. At noon she sat in the shade of the fence and ate the bread and cold meat he'd brought out without complaint, watching the valley below with those quiet gray eyes. He sat nearby and watched it too. The valley was broad and flat and gold with late-season grain as far as he could see, and the village sat in the middle of it with its smoke rising straight in the still air. It was a fine valley. It always had been. "Somebody's watching from the road," she said. He looked. There was a man on horseback at the far end of the lane, one of the Brannock boys, from the look of the horse. The rider sat still for a moment and then turned and rode back toward the village. "They'll talk," Edric said. They were going to anyway. She broke off another piece of bread. "Does it trouble you?" He thought about it honestly, not particularly. She looked at him sideways. Most men it would. Most men are more worried about what their neighbors think than what's true. He dusted flour off his hands and stood up. "Come on, we've got another 3 hours of good light." She stood without another word and picked up the scythe, and they went back to work. That evening, the village headman came to his gate. His name was Aldrich Kress, a careful man with a careful face who had held the headman's chair for 15 years by never taking any position that cost him anything. He came alone, which Edric supposed was meant to signal reasonableness, and he stood at the gate and waited for Edric to come to him rather than coming to the door. "Edric," he said, "I hear you've got a guest." "I've got a recovering traveler who needed shelter and has been helping with my harvest," Edric said. "I didn't know that required a headman's visit." "The valley is—" Kress paused, choosing his words the way a man picks through a bag of coins for the right denomination. "People are uneasy. They don't know her business here. An orc woman alone near the village." "An orc woman with a fever who would have died on the ground if I'd listened to Brannock and Fenn," Edric said. He said it without raising his voice, because he didn't need to raise his voice to mean it. "She's been nothing but decent and nothing but useful, and when she's ready she'll go on her way. If the village is uneasy, I suggest they come out here and take a look for themselves, because there's nothing to see." Kress rubbed the back of his neck. I'm just telling you what people are saying. I appreciate that. Is there something else? There wasn't. Cress left. Edric went back inside to where Myra was sitting at the table, mending a tear in the shoulder of her travel leather with a needle and thread she'd found in his kitchen drawer without being told where to look. She had clearly heard everything through the open window, but she said nothing about it. You could have told him I'd be leaving tomorrow, she said, biting the thread. You're leaving when you're well enough to walk 5 miles without sitting down in a ditch halfway, he said. Not before. She looked at him steadily. That might be tomorrow. Then tomorrow we'll know. She held up the mended leather, checking the seam, then turned it around and looked at the stitching from both sides. You're a stubborn man, Edric Voss. My wife used to say that. What did you say back? I said it was her that chose me. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, warm and brief, like a door opening for a second and then closing again. She set the leather down. She sounds like she was wise. She was wiser than me. Most people are. They sat in easy quiet after that, him with his pipe and her with her mending, and the fire settled into its evening rhythm, and outside the stars came out over the frost-still valley. It was on the 4th day that the first clue appeared, and Edric missed it entirely. He found it afterward, turning it over in his mind, and understood how completely he had failed to see it. At the time it had just seemed like an odd moment, something noticed and then set aside, the way a man sets aside things that don't fit what he already understands. They had gone into the village together for the morning market. He'd needed oats and lamp oil, and she'd said she would come along, which he had not argued about, though he'd noticed how she pulled the hood of his spare coat up before they left. He had not said anything about that either. The market was in the square, 20 or so stalls and twice that many people in the slow weekday traffic. The feeling when they walked in was unmistakable, a ripple of attention, heads turning, the particular silence that falls when a crowd notices something it didn't expect. Edric had been in that silence before, though he'd never been the cause of it. He felt Myra walk steadily beside him and not alter her pace by a step. He stopped at the grain merchant's stall and started negotiating for the oats. Myra stood a half step behind him and to the side, quiet, watching the square. Kester, the grain merchant's apprentice, a young man, 17, the kind of 17 that's still mostly made of other people's opinions, leaned over the counter and said, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, "You should watch your purse, Voss. She's probably counted every coin you've got." Edric looked at him. He didn't respond immediately. He took the time to finish counting out his coins and lay them on the counter, and then he looked at the boy calmly and said, "She's helped me bring in more harvest in 2 days than I'd done in the week before. If she wanted to steal from me, she'd had 4 nights to do it. She hasn't taken so much as a potato." He pocketed his change. "Bag those oats." The boy bagged them. Nobody in earshot said anything. Myra said nothing either while they walked home. But near the end of the lane, when they were nearly back and out of anyone's sight, he felt her hand rest briefly on his elbow, not speaking, not making anything of it, just a second's quiet contact. He nodded and they kept walking. What he hadn't seen, because he'd been looking at the apprentice and not at the far end of the market square. A man in dusty traveling leathers, standing at the edge of the crowd, who had watched them for a long moment before turning and walking, very purposefully, north. He wasn't a man given to prying. His mother had raised him with the principle that a guest's business was their own, and his 38 years of farming had reinforced the idea that most questions are better answered in their own time. So when Myra, on the evening of that 4th day, sat down at his table and seemed to be carrying something heavier than usual, he didn't ask. He put a plate of food in front of her, the same thing he was having, a bit of braised venison from the last of his autumn stores, some roasted roots, bread, and sat across from her and ate. She ate too, but halfway through she set her fork down and said, "Edric, I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. She looked at her plate and then at him. I've been traveling simply, without the things that usually travel with me." She paused, working out how to say it. "There are people looking for me, not to harm me. They travel with me usually to their mine. They work for me. But I set out ahead of them, which I shouldn't have done." "Are they going to find you?" "Yes, probably soon." She met his eyes. "When they do, things will be louder than they have been here." Edric put his own fork down and looked at her steadily. He was 51 years old and had farmed the same valley his whole life, and he was not a clever man in the way of cities or politics, but he understood people well enough to read the shape of what she wasn't saying. He looked at the quality of her leathers, the ghost mark of the bracelet she'd removed, the way she'd moved through every situation in his house, guest and worker and woman at a table, with the same unself-conscious dignity, like someone who had never had to learn how to command a room because she'd simply always commanded one. He said, "You'll tell me what you want to tell me when you want to tell me. I'm not going to pretend it changes the guest right under this roof, because it doesn't." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You're a genuinely good man, Edric Voss." He picked his fork back up. "I'm a man who needs to finish his venison before it goes cold. Eat." She ate. The fifth morning, 3 things happened in quick succession. Myra was in the yard at sunrise, stretching after sleep, when Edric came out with the morning water bucket and found her standing at the fence looking north with an expression he couldn't read, not worry, not exactly, but something alert and intent, like a person listening for a sound they knew was coming. "They're close," she said without turning around. "How do you know?" "I know." She turned from the fence. "Today, probably." Edric set the bucket down. "Do you want to go and meet them? I can mind the farm." She shook her head. "They'll come here. They know where you are." "They've probably known for 2 days," she said. They watch. It's their job." She looked at his face and something softened in hers. "I should have told you sooner what." The dog started barking. Not Edric's dog. He didn't have one. The barking was from down the lane, and then from the far end of the village, and then from somewhere in the middle, one after another, the chain of sound that travels through a valley when something large and unexpected comes down its one main road. Edric and Myra looked at each other. He said, "I'll put the kettle on." She said, "Edric," and then she stopped and just looked at him for a moment with those dark gray eyes, with an expression he couldn't entirely name, grateful and a little sad, and something else underneath, something that looked strangely like apology. "Thank you," she said, "for the soup, for the fire, for not making me feel like something to be afraid of." "You weren't," he said simply, "the kettle." He went inside. The sound came to the farm in layers. First it was distant, the slow thud of hooves on the frozen lane, more than one horse, more than 2, the kind of cadence that belongs to a proper column and not a group of travelers. Then the creak of leather and the chink of tack, and voices calling low to each other in a language Edric didn't know. Then it was at the gate. He came to the door with his mug of tea and looked out. There were 20 of them at least, orc riders on heavy horses, wearing what he understood now to be livery, a deep green and gray with a silver thornwood branch on the breast, a symbol he had never seen but which carried with it, even from across the yard, the unmistakable weight of something official. They sat their horses the way trained soldiers sit, relaxed on the surface, completely coiled underneath, and at their head was a man in a herald's coat who had been the one at the far end of the market square 2 days ago, Edric now realized. The herald looked at Myra, who had come to stand in the center of the yard, and there was visible relief on his face. He dismounted and bowed from the waist, a proper, low, formal bow. "First daughter," he said. Behind Edric, the tea kettle began to whistle. He went and took it off the heat. When he came back to the door, Myra and the herald were talking in low tones, quickly, efficiently, the way a person who has been absent from their responsibilities catches up on them. Two of the riders had dismounted as well and were standing a respectful distance back. The rest remained on horseback, and they were all, Edric noticed this with a particular small jolt, looking at his farmhouse with an expression that was, unmistakably, respect. Myra turned from the herald and walked back toward the door. "Come out," she said, "please." He came out with his mug. "Edric Voss," she said, "this is Calder, my mother's herald. He works for the Thornwood clan." She said it simply, without ceremony. "I am Myra Dawnstone. My mother is Ashna Dawnstone, matriarch of the Thornwood clan." Edric looked at the herald and the riders and the green and gray livery and the silver thorn branch, and then he looked at Myra and he said, "Is that right?" It wasn't a question, or rather it was, but not the kind that needed an answer. He was just catching up. "The Thornwood clan," the herald said. He had the precise, careful voice of someone trained to speak in formal settings, "represents the largest single grain and timber trading interest on the northern frontier. My lady Ashna has been seeking a formal trade agreement with the Valley Alliance for 6 years. She sent her daughter to assess the borderland villages, incognito, without the trappings of rank, to determine which settlements showed genuine goodwill toward orc travelers before any formal council was convened." He paused. "My lady Myra was." "I was not supposed to get sick," Myra said dryly. "She was not supposed to get sick," the herald agreed, with the long-suffering tone of a man who has said some version of this before. "We lost her for 4 days. We have been looking." Edric drank his tea. "The assessment," Myra said, and there was something both businesslike and private in the way she said it, looking at him. "Will note that in this valley there was exactly one door that opened." Edric looked at the lane. Down at the far end he could see figures of villagers standing at a distance, watching the column of riders. He recognized Cress, the headman's gray coat. He recognized Brannock's bulk. He could not see their faces from here, but he could imagine them clearly enough. "It wasn't a door," he said. "I just had a field to work and someone who needed soup." "I know," Myra said. "That's exactly the point." The herald spent the next hour at Edric's kitchen table with a scroll and a pen, taking down the formal record of what had happened. He asked precise questions in his precise voice, and wrote down the answers with the care of a man who knew the document would be read again. Myra sat across from Edric and drank tea and occasionally supplied a detail. The evening she'd been found, the first bowl of broth, the 3 refusals before his door. Edric answered what he was asked and drank his tea, and didn't make any particular fuss. The formal part of it was over in an hour. After the herald rolled his scroll and put his pen away, Myra said, "The council convenes in 6 weeks at the turning of the season. My mother will formally propose the Thornwood grain trade contract to the Valley Alliance, a 10-year agreement, indexed to the harvest price, that would stabilize grain prices for every farm in this valley and guarantee purchase of surplus at fair rate." She said the details with the ease of someone who'd been speaking this language since childhood. "The opening feast of the council, the first night, I would like to hold here." Edric looked at her. "Here. At this table, or we can set a longer one in the yard if the weather allows." She met his eyes. The place where she was received with dignity should be the place where the alliance begins. That's my opinion. My mother will have her own opinion, but... And a small warmth moved through her voice, like a door opening for the second time. "She usually lets me have mine." Edric was quiet for a moment. He thought about the notice still folded in his shirt pocket. He'd almost forgotten it these last 4 days. "The grain contract," he said. "If the valley agreed to it, that would affect the local land price." "Significantly," the herald said. "A guaranteed purchase agreement with the Thornwood clan at fair index would increase the assessed value of valley farmland considerably. Existing debt ratios would adjust accordingly. Many farmers who are currently in difficulty would find their positions substantially improved. Edric set his mug down and looked at the table for a moment. He had not done any of it for this. He knew that, and he knew Myra knew it, and he knew she knew he knew it, which made the moment simple rather than complicated. He had done it because a person was sick in his field in the cold, and the other doors were closed. That was the entire accounting of it. "You can hold the feast here," he said, "on one condition." Myra raised her eyebrows, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. "Name it." "You let me make the soup. I've got a good venison stock, and I won't have someone else's kitchen crew coming in here and doing it differently. The rest of the meal can be whatever you want, but the soup is mine." There was a silence. The herald appeared to be working to keep his face professional. Myra looked at Edric for a long moment with those dark gray eyes, and then the smile opened all the way, warm and full and unguarded, the way a person smiles when they are genuinely, unexpectedly delighted. "Deal," she said. The rest of that day moved the way important days sometimes do, in a series of clear moments separated by long stretches that only make sense in retrospect. Two of the riders stayed at the farm, quartered in the barn without complaint, their horses well behaved, and their own behavior impeccable. Myra spent an hour in quiet conference with the herald at the far end of the yard. Official business, Edric could see from the posture of it, the kind of conversation that belonged to a life he had only barely glimpsed. He left them to it, and went to work on the remaining harvest grain. In the afternoon, Cress the headman came to the gate. He did not come alone this time. 3 of the village aldermen were with him, hats in hand, and their faces wore expressions that Edric had never seen on them before. They looked, he thought, like men who had stepped on a stone they were certain was solid ground and felt it shift. "We'd like to speak with the," Cress began. "She's busy," Edric said. "It's a matter of." "She's busy," Edric said again. "Come back at supper time if you'd like. I'll ask her if she wants to speak with you." He turned and went back to his field. Behind him, he heard Cress say something in a low voice, and one of the aldermen reply. He did not turn around to see their faces, but he heard in their voices the thing he recognized, the sound of a position quietly reconsidering itself, the small seismic adjustment of men who have realized they calculated wrong. He was not glad about it in the way he might have expected. There was no satisfaction in watching careful men reckon with their carelessness. Mostly, he felt tired of the waste of a world that made a decent woman eat soup alone in a kitchen because the inn wouldn't open its door. He swung the scythe and let the grain fall, and somewhere behind him he could hear Myra's voice in the yard, unhurried, businesslike, sure. And it was a good sound. Myra came to him at the fence as the sun went low, walking across the stubble of the field he just cleared. She had her travel coat back on, mended at the shoulder and her hair braided back the proper way, and around her wrist, returned from wherever it had been packed, was the bracelet he'd seen the ghost of, a simple band of worked silver with a thorn branch set into it, worn and genuine, the kind of thing that belonged to a person, not a position. "The herald is riding ahead tonight," she said. "To my mother, he'll carry the report." She came to stand beside him at the fence, looking out across the valley the same way she'd looked out at the north road this morning with those calm, reading eyes. "I'll stay 2 more days while my escort arrives. Then we travel." "All right," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The valley was going gold and the shadows were long, and the village smoke was straight and pale in the still air. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The 6 weeks until the council. You'll have the harvest done before then, but I saw when you first brought me in there was a notice in your pocket." She said it carefully, not as an accusation, just as a fact she'd read without meaning to. "The land creditor." He looked at her. "I'm not offering anything unseemly," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. What I want to ask is, will you be here in 6 weeks?" "I'll be here," he said. I've been here my whole life. Then 6 weeks. She held out her hand, not the gesture of a woman to a man, but of one straight-dealing person to another, formal and honest. The council opens at your table, the Thornwood grain contract goes to the alliance, and the valley price adjusts. Your land is worth what it's worth. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm and direct and unambiguous. Good, she said. He nodded. I'll start on the stock for the soup. She almost laughed. She kept it to a smile, but it was a real one. You know, she said, I have eaten at tables from one end of the northern frontier to the other. Clan councils, trade feasts, formal dinners with more silverware than I knew what to do with. Your soup, she looked at the farmhouse, its low, warm windows coming into light as the dusk came on. Your soup was the best thing I've eaten in a long time. I don't know if it was the soup itself or the circumstance. Probably both, Edric said. Probably both, she agreed. They stood at the fence a while longer, the two of them, looking out at the valley in the last of the day's light. The ridge to the east had gone dark and the stars were beginning, and the frost was already on the stubble underfoot, and the village down the lane had its lamps on in the windows, and none of it had changed, but something in the weight of it had. The way a place you've walked 1,000 times can look different when you've had a reason to look at it fresh. What does Thornwood mean? Edric asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. The symbol on the livery, the thorn branch. It's from a story, Myra said, about a tree that grows in the worst soil, bare rock, poor ground, the kind of place nothing else will take root. The thorn tree grows there anyway, and it grows hard and strong, and its flowers bloom in the early spring before anything else, before the frost is fully gone. She was quiet a moment. My grandmother chose it. She started the clan with nothing, in a valley nobody else wanted. She said the thorn tree didn't wait for good conditions. It bloomed with what it had. Edric thought about that. That's a good story, he said. She was a good woman, Myra said. I never met her, but I know it. The 2 days she'd said turned to 3. He didn't point that out. The escort arrived on the second morning, 6 more riders, a supply wagon, a woman who seemed to function as an aide-de-camp, and who moved through Edric's yard and barn with the brisk competence of someone who organized large things for a living. They were quiet and professional and unobtrusive in the way that took deliberate training, and they treated the farm and its owner with a careful respect that was, Edric thought, partly official and partly something that had filtered down from Myra herself. He watched her with them and saw, now that he was looking for it, how naturally it all fit. The slight shift in how she stood when she was being someone's first daughter instead of a woman at his kitchen table. The ease with which she held a thread of 3 different conversations without losing any of them. The way the aide-de-camp deferred without being servile, the way the riders watched her without making it obvious, the 100 small adjustments of people around a person who, somewhere above the immediate moment, has weight. She was still herself in the kitchen, though. That didn't change. She made tea and sat at the table and talked about the harvest and the frost and the quality of the valley soil, and once, late in the second evening, about her mother. Not as the matriarch, but as a woman who made very good cheese and was terrible at cards, and had an opinion about everything from treaties to bootlaces. And was, Myra said with the careful understatement of someone who loved a person very much, not always easy. Edric told her about his wife, Sarah, how she'd liked the spring more than any other season, and had always planted more flower seeds than vegetables in the kitchen garden, and been completely unapologetic about it. How she'd been the one who thought of the glass window for the main room because the original was a shutter, and she'd said she wanted to be able to see the valley from the table without putting on a coat. How the house had been one size when she was in it and a different size after. Is it lonely? Myra asked. Sometimes, he said. Mostly it's just quiet. I've gotten used to the quiet. She looked at the window at the night valley. Quiet isn't always bad. No, he agreed, it isn't. On the 3rd morning she saddled up. The escort formed around her with the practiced ease of people who'd done it many times, and her aide-de-camp produced a written document from a saddlebag and brought it to Edric, the formal notice of the council invitation, the date, the venue listed as the Voss Farm, Grayville Valley, a line about the Thornwood clan's intention to propose a regional grain agreement, and at the bottom, a personal notation in a clear and confident hand. The soup is a condition of the arrangement. M.D. Edric looked at it for a moment and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, in the same place the debt notice had been. Myra, already mounted, looked down at him from the height of her horse with those gray eyes. In the morning light, with the livery around her and the thorn branch on her wrist, she was clearly and unmistakably what she was, a clan daughter, a diplomat, a person of consequence traveling the northern frontier with 20 riders. But her expression was the same one he'd first seen across the breakfast table, careful, measuring, and now also something else. Warm. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he said. I'll have the stock going by the 5th. A corner of her mouth moved. She touched her horse's flank and it moved forward, and the escort fell in around her, and the column went up the lane toward the north road, the green and gray livery bright in the morning light, the horses moving with a steady measured pace that carried with it the weight of something official and real and in motion. He watched them until they crossed the ridge and were gone. Then he went inside and took the debt notice out of his pocket and smoothed it on the table and looked at it for a long time. 37 gold marks. He thought about the grain contract and the value adjustment, and the way the herald had said substantially improved in his careful, formal voice. He folded the notice back up. Not because anything had changed yet, but because in 6 weeks something would, and it was enough to know it was coming. He put the kettle on. The 6 weeks moved in the way of harvest to winter, fast in the middle, slow at the edges. He finished the grain harvest. He mended the roof of the barn before the serious frost arrived. He sold the surplus at the autumn market and paid down a modest portion of the debt, not enough, but more than nothing, which was more than he'd had in prospect 2 months ago. He did not speak particularly about the council, because he was a man who spoke after things happened and not before. The village noticed, though. Word travels in a valley the way water does through every crack and channel, finding its own level regardless of what anyone intends. Cress had apparently put together the outline of what was coming faster than Edric had expected, because one morning in the 4th week he came to the gate again, hat in hand, and this time his face had none of its careful calculations in it. It was just a face, a man's face, with something uncomfortable in it. I understand, Cress said, that there's going to be a council here. That's right, Edric said, and that it concerns the Thornwood clan's grain agreement. That's right. Cress was quiet for a moment. The Alliance farms would benefit. Yes. Another silence. Cress turned his hat in his hands. He was a careful man, and careful men don't apologize easily, because an apology is a position taken, and positions are expensive. But he stood there in the lane in the late autumn morning and turned his hat and seemed, for once, uncertain of his arithmetic. I should have, he started. You should have, Edric said, not cruelly, but it's done. And the woman, Myra Dawnstone, is the first daughter of the Thornwood Matriarch, Edric said, and she was sick in my field on a cold night and no one in the village would open a door. He looked at Cress. I'm not going to put it differently than that. You'll have to decide what to do with it. Cress nodded slowly and walked back down the lane. Brannock sent a note 3 days later. Formal, correct, the kind of note that takes longer to write than it looks because every word is considered. He was sorry for the circumstances. He hoped the council would benefit the valley. He was pleased the woman had recovered. Edric read it twice and put it with his papers and didn't respond. Not in cruelty, just because there was nothing to say that the note itself hadn't already said, and some things are complete when they're written. Fenn the physician didn't write or visit. But one evening in the 5th week, Edric saw him at the edge of the autumn market, saw him, specifically, watching a young orc man at the woodcarver's stall, a traveler passing through with a small pack and a limp, and saw Finn stand there for a long time watching, and then slowly, awkwardly, go over and speak to him. Edric didn't see what was said. He went on with his marketing. The morning of the council arrived with a hard frost, and a sky so clear it was almost painful. The Thornwood column came down the valley road at mid-morning. Not 20 riders this time, but 40, plus the supply wagon, plus 2 additional wagons that he now understood carried the formal goods of the occasion. The clan's trade documents, the feast provisions, the things that belong to an event that will be written into the permanent record of 2 peoples deciding to do business. At the head of the column, before anyone else, was Myra. And beside her, on a horse that was darker and larger, and moved with the particular assurance of something that had been well bred for a long time, was a woman who could only be her mother. Ashna Dawnstone was not tall, not for an orc woman, though she was tall enough by any other measure, and she was older than her daughter by 30 years, her face weathered and lined in the way of someone who had lived a long life in the open, her black hair gone silver at the temples and braided tight. She wore a long traveling coat in thornwood green, with a thorn branch on the breast in heavier silver than her daughter's, and she had the eyes of a woman who had been making consequential decisions for decades and had come to find them restful. She looked at Edric's farmhouse as the column came through the gate, and something moved in her face, brief, deliberate, the look of someone who has made a picture from a description and is now comparing them. Myra brought her horse alongside and dismounted first. "Edric," she said, and there was a brightness in her face quietly there contained. "My mother." Ashna Dawnstone dismounted and stood before him, and studied him with those deliberate eyes for a moment. "So," she said, her voice was low and measured, carrying a faint accent, "you're the one who made the soup." "I am," Edric said. "My daughter tells me it was venison stock, with dried root vegetables and some smoked pork, nothing complicated. She also tells me you tried the inn and the physician first, and when they refused, you carried her home yourself." "She needed shelter," he said. Ashna looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way a person does when they want to make sure they understand something clearly. Then she said, "In our clan's custom, when a person shelters a member of the Thornwood family at need, true shelter, given at cost to themselves, they're owed a formal acknowledgement, a public one." She glanced at the village, at the lane where, Edric could see, a considerable number of people had found reasons to be standing in the morning air. "I intend to give it." He started to say that wasn't necessary, but she held up one hand, a small, absolute gesture. "Not for you, though it's for you too. For the valley, so they understand what happened here and what it means." She said it without rancor, without theater. Just the quiet weight of a woman who had been making things clear for a very long time. "And because my daughter asked me to, and she's usually right." Myra, standing just behind her mother's shoulder, caught his eye. That corner of her mouth moved again. The table was set in the yard, because the weather held and the yard was better for the numbers involved. Myra's aide-de-camp had organized it with her particular efficiency. Long boards on trestles, cloth from the supply wagon, the thornwood green and silver down the center in a formal arrangement that managed to be grand without making the farm look small. The village had been invited. Myra had sent Cress a formal written notice 3 days prior, and every farmer in the Valley Alliance had received one as well. And the result was that by midday there were close to 100 people in and around Edric's yard, standing in the careful way of people who are not sure how much space they're allowed to take up. Edric made the soup. He made 6 large pots of it, which was 4 more pots than he'd ever had occasion to use at once, and Myra's kitchen staff had offered twice to take over and he had declined twice, politely and finally, and they had adapted to this with professional grace and simply worked around him. The stock had been going since the 5th, 6 days of slow simmering, the venison bones and the dried roots and the smoked pork, and then the additions for the feast. Fresh herbs from the last of the autumn garden, good salt, a touch of the late harvest grain thickened in, and the result was, he thought, the best batch he'd made. He carried the first pot out to the table himself. Ashna Dawnstone was standing at the head of the table in the yard, and when Edric came through the farmhouse door with the pot, she did something he had not expected. She stepped back from the head of the table and gestured him forward. "The host serves first," she said, loud enough to be heard. He set the pot on the stand that had been prepared for it, and ladled the first bowl, and set it in front of the empty place at the head, which he then looked at and understood was his. The yard was quiet. The 100 people in it were looking at him, villagers and alliance farmers and Thornwood riders, and the formal delegates who had arrived with the clan's trade documentation, all of them, in the pale winter sun, looking at a 51-year-old farmer with a soup ladle. He sat down. Ashna Dawnstone sat to his right, and Myra sat to his left, and the rest of the table filled in from there. And for a moment before the formal council business, before the trade documents were produced and the agreement was read aloud, and the valley headmen put their names to it, before any of the long official afternoon that followed. For a moment, it was just the soup and the table and the cold, bright air and the warmth of a great many people sitting down together. Ashna Dawnstone tasted the soup. She was quiet for a moment, and the silence had the quality of something genuine, not the theatrical pause of a person being polite, but the actual silence of a person who is tasting something and attending to it. "Good," she said. "Thank you," Edric said. "The smoked pork," she said. "How long does it cook in?" "From the beginning," he said. "You want it to give everything it has." She considered that, then nodded once, as if he had said something true and worth keeping. The trade agreement was formal and detailed, and took most of the afternoon to read, discuss, and sign. Edric sat through all of it at his own table in his own yard, listening to men and women talk about grain prices and surplus guarantees and seasonal rate indexes, and he understood maybe 2/3 of it, which was enough to know that it was exactly what the Herald had described. Fair, stable, and sufficient to lift the arithmetic that had been pressing on this valley for the better part of a decade. When it was done, the signatures made, the documents rolled and sealed and put back in the Thornwood wagon, Ashna Dawnstone rose and stood at the head of the table and addressed the valley in a voice that had learned, over a long career, how to carry without shouting. "The Thornwood clan has done business in every valley on the northern frontier," she said. "I have attended councils in longhouses and market halls and the open fields of 7 different clans. In 30 years of trade, I have never made an agreement in a human settlement where my people were received as full persons until today." She paused. "That is not a complaint about the other valleys. It is a statement about this one." She looked at Edric. "About one man in this one, who is not a diplomat, not a trader, not a person with any particular reason to care, except that he was decent. And decency, in my experience, is worth more than a very great deal." She sat down. In the quiet that followed, because there was a quiet, a genuine one, the kind that falls when a room understands that something true has just been said in it, Myra leaned slightly toward Edric and said, in a voice quiet enough that only he could hear, "She doesn't say that, ever, to anyone." Edric picked up his bowl and finished his soup. "It's good soup," he said. The column left in the early evening. The documents had been distributed. The feast had wound down through the afternoon into the easy, unscheduled talk of people who have sat together long enough to stop being formal, and the valley farmers had gone home with the agreement, and with something else, something that didn't have a name on a trade document, but that Edric could see in the way they'd talked among themselves in the second half of the afternoon, quieter and more genuine than the first. Cress came to him before he left, and he said, without preamble or ceremony, "I understand now what I missed." Edric nodded. "I don't know that I can promise anything," Cress said, "but I understand it." "That's enough to start," Edric said, and meant it. The column formed at the gate. 40 riders and the wagons and all the compact, organized machinery of an official Thornwood passage. Ashna Dawnstone passed through the gate and paused her horse and looked back at the farmhouse one more time, and something moved in her face that might have been satisfaction or might have been something older and more personal, and then she rode on. Myra was last. She brought her horse to a stop in the gate and looked down at him, and for a moment it was the same as it had been that first morning across the breakfast table, the careful measuring look, and the warmth underneath it. "Spring Council," she said. "In the clan longhouse 50 miles north, you're invited as a formal guest." She paused. "You should come." "I might," he said. "The soup won't be as good there," she said. "I want you to know that in advance." "I'll manage." She smiled the full, open smile, the one she didn't ration, and turned her horse and rode through the gate and up the lane toward the north road. He watched the green and gray column until it crossed the ridge and the sound of it faded, and then the valley was quiet again, the way it was always quiet in the evening, the lamps coming on in the farmhouse windows and the frost already on the ground and the stars beginning in the dark above the ridge. He went inside. The table was still set from the feast. The Thornwood cloths would be collected tomorrow, but the bowls and spoons were his, and the pots were his, and the smell of the soup was still warm in the kitchen air. He poured the last of the stock from the cold pot into a cup and sat down at the table. In his shirt pocket, folded as it had been since the morning of the harvest, was the debt notice, 37 gold marks, due by the first day of next month. He took it out and set it on the table. Tomorrow he would take it to the land creditor with the payment from the market sale and the verbal assurance of the Thornwood agreement, and the creditor would do his arithmetic and find that the numbers were different than they had been, and the north field would remain what it had always been, his father's ground, broken by a hand plow 50 years ago, and his. That was tomorrow. Tonight he sat with the last of the soup and the quiet of his good house, and somewhere in the middle of the valley, the last riders were crossing the ridge under the early stars, and the season was turning, and the long winter was ahead. He had soup enough to last it. He had the north field. And in his pocket, alongside the debt notice, was a folded document in a formal hand, with a line at the bottom in a clear and confident script that he had read 3 times already today and would read again. "The soup is a condition of the arrangement, M.D." He finished his cup and washed the last pot, and went to bed, and slept better than he had in a long time.